I would now like to invite up Paul Chapman. There's Paul, our keynote sponsor. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm very happy to be here and very proud to support ECA and the initiative. I've spent my life in the area, although like many of you, I tend to go to Toronto a fair bit. This has always been home to me, and I grew up here and live near Talisman in Beaver Valley, actually. So it holds a place close to my heart, definitely. So I think we're all here for the same reason. And this is quite a community. I was talking with a few people earlier, and it's unclear when you have an initiative this young and new and fresh, how much interest you'll really garner. And this is a testament to that and the community that's building here and everything that's behind it. So thank you very much. And I'm going to introduce, we're all here to learn, so I'm going to introduce Dr. Kelly Cerialo. She's an associate professor and program coordinator in the Business and Hospitality Department at Paul Smith College, co-chair of the UNESCO campaign Adirondack Biosphere Reserve in New York and Vermont, coordinator of the U.S. UNESCO Biosphere Network, and co-founder of the U.S. Biosphere Reserve Youth Network. Very decorated. And involved. In 2024, she was appointed by the Director General of UNESCO to the International Advisory Committee for Biosphere Reserves. Her work focuses on enhancing the human-nature connection to improve both environmental and human health. So with that, we're all here to learn and hear from someone who's been there. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you. I'm gonna get my laptop.
Are you mic'd up?
Do you need this? Do you need this?
No, we'll leave this here then. I'll just grab my laptop to get set up. Perfect. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'll use the full room. Jarvis is not kidding. It is packed. So great to see you all. Good morning. I'm equally as excited for today. Hopefully, this is a bad idea. This is not going to end well. All right. Let's get this coffee out of the way. I'll put this down here. All right. And Jeff, for the transitions, do I face you or this way? Okay, perfect. All right, let me just get this logged in and we'll get started. All right. So thank you again so much to our sponsors and for all of you waking up this morning. I flew in from Paris yesterday, so I was a bit jet lagged, but to see all these amazing faces this morning, I'm so grateful to be here and to hear about your experiences. So to get started, I'm curious. I always like to know who's in the audience. I'm a professor, right? So I like to understand kind of where we're coming from with our knowledge, right? So by a show of hands, do I have any corridor experts in the room? Ecological corridor expert. Oh, don't be shy. You should be an expert. That's okay. Okay. So okay, this is great. Okay, great. Okay, so I see some. All right. If you are knowledgeable about ecological corridors, but also want to learn more, so middle of the way. Let's see a show of hands, middle of the way. Wow. I'm going to sit down now. I can actually go home, Jarvis. I'm good. I'm good. This is good. So the third group then, no knowledge of ecological corridors. This is maybe the first or second time that you've heard about it. Okay, cool. Don't be shy. Okay, great. All right, so this is good. So my answer now is we have a great mix of everyone in the room. So my goal today is to share with you a little bit of knowledge that I have. I'm by no means an expert on ecological corridors, I will say that. I have a working knowledge of it, but I think we learn each day. So my goal for you today is to share with what I've seen not only in my home biosphere reserve in the Champlain Adirondack, but also internationally. And I'm going to be honest with you, there's no perfect corridor system. And so what I'm going to share with you today is exactly what Jarvis was saying, finding the solution for what works in your area. So that's what we're going to do today. Jarvis, I'm going to try to keep up with the slides just like you did, so we share the same problem. So my presentation is broken up into 3 areas. So the first, I'm going to be just defining what the heck a nature corridor is. In IUCN standards, there's a lot of definitions, and quite honestly, when I first heard about it, I was like, wait, are we going with biological corridor? Are we going with ecological corridor? Is it a native wildlife corridor? So we're gonna go through and define how we're gonna talk about it today, just at least in my presentation. After that, I'm going to share with you the challenges and opportunities that we have. There's a lot of challenges, as you know. Jarvis mentioned some of them earlier, with development projects, with infrastructure development. And then I'm going to share two examples that I think are great examples from some in our own backyard and then some further than that. And then lastly, most importantly, I'm going to try to give you some resources of what might be helpful as you're building your corridor here. Sound good? Cool. All right. So, in terms of why we're here today, I do want to share some not so great positive things because, as you know, the reason we're sitting in this room is largely because of what's happening with biodiversity loss and habitat loss. So I'll start on the negative side, but then again, I think it's really important to be solution focused and find solutions to make this better, and that's why we're here to talk about corridors. Whoop. Got too much going on here with the transition. So first and foremost, as you know, those that raise their hand and know a lot about corridors, the reason that we need connectivity is that right now, especially in the face of climate change, there's habitat fragmentation and biodiversity loss happening at a really rapid scale. So most importantly, that's why we're here to talk about this. Second, and this is related to what I was just talking about, climate change is increasing the rate at which migration is happening with species and biodiversity and habitat loss, like I just mentioned. Even more scary is that 1 million species are at risk of extinction. So that's something that's pretty sobering to think about. So this is why I think corridors are very interesting. So even though protected areas and OECMs, so OECMs are other effective area-based conservation measures. Who knows of these? Who knows of oh, awesome, okay, cool. So OECMs, I'm gonna be using this acronym a lot. So for example, an OECM could be something along the lines of an indigenous territory. So it's not designated as a national park, but it's an indigenous territory that has strong conservation practices. It could also be something like a privately owned easement. So I'll be referring to those throughout the presentation. So if you hear OECMs, that's what I'm talking about. So even though protected areas and OECMs are great, in the absence of a corridor or connectivity, what are we doing? Right? You're still going to have habitat loss. You're still going to have biodiversity loss. And there's fragmentation. And so the work that I do at the U.S. Biosphere Network level with the Center for Large Landscape Conservation looks at how that connectivity can happen. And like I said before, the challenging part is it's not easy. Connectivity is really complicated, and especially with climate change, it's making it even more complicated. So I really like what IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, says. They say that ecological corridors are the glue of conservation networks, and in the absence of them, again, what are we doing? We can have a great protected area, an OECM on the side, but without connectivity, you're still having that diversity loss and the fragmentation. And so the need that we talk a lot about within IUCN, within the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, and within UNESCO's Biosphere Reserve Program is to develop connected conservation networks. So not only just having protected areas, not only just having OECMs, but thinking on a large scale basis, how can we connect all of them together? And it sounds like that's what you're doing based on what Jarvis said, though it's great news. So as you can see here, this is a really long list of terminology that we use to talk about corridors, right? This is something that IUCN was a bit frustrated with. They were sick of kind of scientists sitting around throwing out these terms and not having a common language to talk about it, not agreeing upon it. And so what we did was we got together members of the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, members of the UN, and a lot of other international organizations got together to agree upon a common language. So the language that's highlighted in green is the language that I'm going to be using today. So you'll see throughout the presentation, I'll refer to it as ecological corridor or nature corridor. I went with nature corridor because that's what you had for the title of the summit, but most commonly we say ecological corridors. That's the preferred common language that we're using now. Ecological connectivity, and I'll go over the definition of that shortly. The ecological network for conservation, again, I'll be sharing the definition. And then the last two is OECMs, which I gave away earlier, and of protected areas, everyone knows what they are, okay? So to frame the conversation, it's important first to define what connectivity actually is and how I'm referring to that and how we talk about it in the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, IUCN, and most of these international organizations. So we define, the Convention for Migratory Species defines ecological connectivity, I'll go verbatim, the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. That definition, as you see, is relatively general. The idea is it was designed to be digestible to the everyday person, but also to emphasize the need of connectivity. For our scientists in the room, who are scientists in the room? We have any scientists? Okay, great. The definition on the bottom is for you. I couldn't leave that out, right? So that's another definition of how you're defining connectivity, and it gets into the core of the science behind the importance of connectivity. So again, the reason I raise this is that a lot of the work around corridors and connectivity has been just figuring out how can we agree upon a common theme and a common language of how to approach this, because every area is different. So you had a lot of really smart people sitting in rooms arguing over how to call this and how to go about it. So finally, we've settled on this, and I'm okay with that. So, okay. So the second, and most importantly for our conversation today, is the idea of an ecological corridor. Again, the name of this summit is Nature Corridor, so I'm using the terms interchangeably. But ecological corridors, they define, this is by IUCN standards, is that it's a clearly defined geographical space that's governed and managed over the long term to maintain or restore effective ecological connectivity. One part of this definition that I want to highlight for you, and Jarvis had mentioned it earlier, the idea of management. We often say at IUCN, you can't manage what you can't monitor. So it's great to create these corridors, but monitoring them over the long term is really what's key. So, and I'm going to share with you in terms of how these are created and what these can look like in a variety of scenarios. Oh, I'm going. There we go. I'm trying to go forward, one forward. There we go, thank you. Okay, so the last definition that I want to put up here until we start getting into the guts of it is this idea of an ecological network for conservation. So the previous slide talked about the need for corridors. So how do you actually connect the protected areas and OECMs? That's what an ecological corridor is. But more importantly, and what it sounds like you're doing a really good job at starting to design here at ECA, is the idea of an ecological network for conservation. So the idea that you have some protected areas in there, you have OECMs in there, and then you're going to have ecological corridors. That's the overall area, right? So this entire ecological network for conservation is the area that you're going to be talking about. So we define this as a system of core habitats, again, protected areas and OECMs, connected ecological corridors, which is established, restored as needed, and maintained to conserve biological diversities in systems that have been fragmented. Cool. So now we have a basic understanding of the terminology. You have no idea how many years those terms took to define. So it sounds simple today, but it was, again, a bunch of smart people in a room arguing over the language around this. So I'm happy to share with you this outcome. All right. So I want to share something with you. And to me, this chart, this graph, is really telling. So in short, what I'm about to show you is that we're making really good progress in terms of the 30 by 30. Not enough, but we're making good progress. So The idea here, and what this chart is going to show you, is that we've made significant strides in protecting regions, but the problem is that connectivity and corridors have not followed suit, okay? So, between 1990 and May 2023, thank you. Let me just make sure, here we go. So, between 1990 and May 2023, we made great progress. In 1990, 7.7% of our terrestrial land globally was protected, right? Flash forward to 2023, we're now at 17.1%. That's pretty good progress, right? We're not at 30 by 30 yet, right? We're still making progress there, but we're making good progress. In terms of marine protected areas, so this includes protected areas and OECMs, it increased from 4% up to 8.3%. That was a significant increase from 1990 to 2023. And again, that sounds great. To me, if you told me that statistic, especially if sitting in UNESCO or these international organizations, I'd be like, thumbs up, this is good progress. We're making great progress. The problem is, and what I've learned from my much smarter colleagues at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation that are experts in connectivity and ecological corridors, is that that's not enough. Because what's happening is when we're creating these protected and conserved areas, OECMs and protected areas, without corridors and connectivity, it's still the same problem. There's still biodiversity loss, there's still habitat loss. The impacts of climate change are gonna continue to exacerbate those issues because things are disconnected. So, this is what's sad to me, and this is the work that we need to improve on. Out of the total terrestrial surface area, only 7% is both protected and connected, okay? So of the 17% that we're at right now, of the global protected areas, of the 17%, only 7% are actually protected and connected. So we have a lot of room for improvement. What we're trying to do at the UNESCO level, with IUCN, and a lot of other multinational organizations, we're trying to figure out how can we kind of get ahead of this. We know that we need to protect, but not enough people are talking about corridors and the connectivity. More and more are now, but it kind of seemed after the fact. We wish it had happened differently. We wish we had this level of knowledge about the importance of connectivity when we started talking about 30 by 30, when we started talking about the need to conserve more areas quicker. Right? So this to me, I can go home now. I'm done with my presentation. This is all you need to know. But there's the complexity in this is that it's not easy. And it's what Jarvis was talking about before, because each area is different. Each community has different needs. Each, for a variety of reasons, I'll get into it shortly, but there's challenges that prevent this idea of connectivity and corridors from happening. Okay. Oh, and by the way, so the marine areas of connectivity have not been assessed yet. So only the terrestrial areas have been assessed. So I want to show you, just for reference, and by the way, a lot of the slides here, these were put together not just by me, by team members from the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. So our senior conservationists have worked on this. A lot of these slides are also an outcome from the IUCN connectivity guidelines. So the pictures that you're seeing on the right are referred to, I strongly suggest, and that's in the resources section at the end of the presentation, is checking out the connectivity guidelines. So in this section, in this chapter of the connectivity guidelines, we look at examples of what good ecological networks for conservation look like. The one I have on the screen here is of Costa Rica. And I don't know, you probably can't see it in the back. In kind of the neon green, those are biological corridors, what I'm calling today ecological corridors. So you see here, can you guys see that in the back there? Okay, so you're okay. The neon green helps, that's good. So what you're gonna see in the, it's more of a pinkish purplish, is a biological reserve. And then we have national parks, so our traditional protected areas in the dark green there. And what you see here, Costa Rica has done a really darn good job at integrating biological corridors. So you're seeing the neon that's helping connect these spaces throughout, okay? This wasn't by accident. They did this by design. They were very intentional. Their method was extremely similar to what you're doing. They involved the community. It was a bottom-up approach, cross-sector partnerships, cross-sector funding, and they were very strategic. Again, it didn't happen overnight, but look at that connectivity there. That's a pretty darn good model. They argue that they can improve, but to me that looks pretty good. So I just wanted to show you for framing what an example of ecological networks for conservation can look like. So Costa Rica is a great example. There's a lot more, but that's one to get us started. So why? Why do we have to think about this? Why does connectivity matter in the face of climate change? So seeing all the hands that were raised, I think a lot of you know most of this, so I don't think I'm telling you new things, but in terms of the framing and the urgency around this, I'll talk about this. So I mentioned earlier, climate migration is a significant issue, right? We all know that. The idea the temperatures are changing, animals are moving in different directions that they haven't moved before, and that increases the need for connectivity and to provide ways for them to connect between these conserved areas and even not in the conserved areas, even where we're living. The second reason, genetic diversity. So species need large and connected areas to avoid inbreeding and to ensure genetic diversity. When you have protected areas that are separate or do not provide corridors for these animals to connect, inbreeding can happen. So that's a significant issue, and thinking about biodiversity, it becomes a really big problem. So corridors often include ecosystems like wetlands and forests that act as buffers against floods, storms, and other extreme weather events. Jarvis had mentioned earlier, we all saw what was happening in Florida and all the hurricanes that just happened in the States. When you have corridors, they help with areas like wetlands and forests create buffers for natural disasters that unfortunately we're going to be seeing more of. So connected ecosystems are more resilient to invasive species, disease, and then again, natural disasters. So again, when we think of this, connectivity is the key piece here. And then lastly, connected areas, larger connected landscapes, tend to store more carbon. That helps with mitigating the impacts of climate change. So whether that's forest or wetlands with carbon sequestration, connected areas tend to provide that. Okay, so now we know why connectivity matters in the face of climate change. Again, that's the urgency around this issue and why we should be thinking about that, as Jarvis talked about before, when we're developing these corridors for ECA. So I'm gonna, for the sake of time, I'm gonna skip this. What I'm going to talk about on this particular slide, I just want to highlight, because I covered some of it in the other slide already. One thing to think about is that when we're talking about, I'm doing a bad job too at this transition. Can we go back one? Thanks so much. Thanks. I want to highlight here, in CLLC, the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, when we talk about connectivity, we often talk about wildlife corridors, and we think a lot in terms of terrestrial landscapes. But I want to emphasize here on the bottom, when we're talking about connectivity, it's not just terrestrial landscapes. It's terrestrial, marine, freshwater, and air spaces. So when you're thinking about that, think about your region and how all of those different types of landscapes factor into that connectivity. So another important piece about ecological corridors is thinking about human well-being, right? So it's not just about protecting nature, but it's also about us, how we exist in this society and how we benefit from having connected landscapes. Thanks. Jeff's helping out in the back. So first and foremost, nature corridors can contribute to clean water, air, soil, and benefiting the surrounding community. So thinking about the contributions of connectivity to greater ecosystem services. Also, I heard, and just by nature of where we are right now, Connected areas and connected corridors allow for better nature-based tourism, and it helps increase sustainable agriculture. Fisheries benefit from healthy, connected communities. And then lastly, this is not a surprise, but access to green spaces and connected green spaces promotes mental well-being, reducing stress, and enhancing the quality of life, as you all know by living in this beautiful space. That's no surprise to you. All right. So next, I want to highlight some of the challenges. And from before I came here, I was prepping. I was watching a lot of videos. I saw a lot of videos of Bruce. I saw a lot of work that you're doing around this area to get community input. So it was interesting when I was preparing this slide to talk about the challenges, I heard of these same challenges that you're dealing with here. So the challenges on my slide are from global examples, but it's something that you're seeing in your own community here. So, no surprise, land use conflicts are often challenges to creating connected landscapes and integrating corridors. So I heard some examples about some new development projects that are on the docket here and that are leading to some potential conflicts with land use management here. Agriculture development, infrastructure often compete with corridor establishment. So you're not unique in this, right? The question is, and I think at least from what I've heard, you're already doing a really good job to listen to the community about what they need to address these challenges. And I have to say, I read your report and I watched the video on the answers that you got from your survey. I was blown away about the results from that survey. So the survey was asking the community's input about ECA and establishing this corridor. And I have to be honest, I haven't seen that strong of community feedback ever. So you've done something right. The fact that this room is full, you've done something right. So that's a step in the right direction. Yeah, and kudos, yeah. So, and the reason that's important, and Jarvis, I think, mentioned this, right? Community input is at the guts of every single one of these connectivity projects. Without community input, it's not going to work. And so the idea that you're all here, that you've responded to the survey, that you were in support of this happening, and not everyone, right? So I did see some of the, anti, survey results. That's natural. That's going to happen. But I'm really impressed by the degree of community involvement, and that's inspiring to me. So there is something else that is a significant challenge to developing corridors. There's a lack of systematic conservation planning. In the next slide, I'm going to show you, in IUCN, we talk about these ideas, it's CARE principles. And so these principles help guide when you're making a connected landscape. And if you don't have systematic conservation planning that's happening, again, typically from the ground up, it's going to be really hard to create a large-scale connected landscape. Obviously, this is an issue. I work a lot with biospheres in Italy right now I'm working with a transboundary one between Slovenia and Italy. And it's interesting because you have, different policy and governance issues here, right within your area, but then add it to a different country, right? So as you can imagine, when you talk to these, I'm talking to a biosphere reserve, again, that's transboundary, the Julian Alps biosphere, and the policy and governance issues are what's preventing their connectivity. They're trying like heck, but it's funny because, again, language is also a barrier. There's cultural differences. There's a lot of factors. So when you think about policy and governance across borders, it's challenging, but it can also be challenging in between communities, as you know. So that can create significant challenges in creating connected landscapes. This is no surprise. I was surprised, actually. Jarvis said before, Jarvis, sorry to quote you on this, but Jarvis had mentioned, we don't need a lot of money, right? So we don't need a lot of money for connectivity. You do and you don't, right? So this people power goes a long way, and the money comes after it, right? So I like that I'm calling Jarvis out. You can get me later, Jarvis. You can get me back later. So, but it's interesting because people power goes a long way, but funding and resources, knowledge being a resource to do this is extremely important, but that is typically a significant barrier to creating connected landscapes. In some regions, I work also in South Africa. I work with a lot of biosphere reserves in the Western Cape of South Africa. Not only do they not have funding, but they also don't have the scientific knowledge to do it. So when I talk about resources, it can also be kind of social capital and knowledge resources to make the connected corridors a reality. Okay, so just like Jarvis, I'm solutions focused. So we know the challenges now, but now let's think about some solutions for this. So one thing I want to share with you, and this, at the end of the presentation, I have a document that's linked in there. I also shared it with Jarvis and Melissa, and I hope that it can be sent out to participants. But IUCN has an incredible list of resources and guidelines of how to do this. There's really, again, smart experts that have been working on this for years. So one of their key aspects of creating connected landscapes is thinking about, again, systematic conservation planning and using these care principles. So they use care principles of connectivity, adequacy, meaning the size and the distribution of protected areas. They talk about representation, and they think about the full range of biodiversity, making sure that they're not creating or cutting off certain areas, but that it's representative of biodiversity in that region. And then lastly, efficiency. So thinking about optimizing the allocation of resources, whether it's natural resources or funding, that's related to creating these conservation areas. We already mentioned this. Community involvement's key. You have that. Keep that going, because that, to me, in any successful conservation project, especially a large-scale connected landscape, community is at the root of that, and that's all of you that are living and sitting, in this room and have participated. Another good example of community involvement is actually in Kenya. I was blown away. So they actually have community-run corridors. So they were designed by community members, and the need from it came from the bottom up. It was the community noticing that they needed to make a change in order to facilitate better wildlife connectivity. In that region specifically, there's incredible wildlife there, and the community members were seeing the fragmentation of habitats with the development of roads and the increase in tourism in that area. So again, a great example to look at and to refer to. Another solution, I mentioned this earlier, in the examples that I'm going to share with you shortly, financing is great when you get kind of the initial financing. And I'll show you, again, some examples of how that started out, maybe with private sector financing or coming from government. But the real way to do it is a mix of both, right? So figuring out how can you diversify your funding availability. Ideally, it's a mix from government and then maybe private sector to support. But that's, in terms of long-term planning, we know that needs to happen. And lastly, so community involvement is linked to this, but the idea of collaborative governance. And so encouraging transboundary cooperations between nations, indigenous groups, NGOs, and local governments. One of the case studies I'm going to share with you today is the EU, it's European Union Alpine Wolf Corridor. That involves 4 countries. And so the amount of collaborative governance that happens between those 4 countries, all that speak different languages, is quite impressive. But they've made it happen on a large scale. So I'll share that with you in a little bit. Okay. So the next section I want to talk about, and something that we realize at UNESCO specifically, is that policy frameworks are really important in developing ecological corridors. Although policy takes a long time to implement, sometimes at the state level, sometimes national level, internationally even longer, I just want to share with you some of the policy frameworks that exist. Perfect, thank you. So we've all, I think, heard at this time, by now we know about the CBD and the Global Biodiversity Framework. So what I've been referencing, that 30 by 30 target, is really emphasizing the need to protect 30% of our lands and oceans by 2030. But to me, the key piece of this, within Target 3 of CBD, they specifically mention well-connected protected areas and OECM. So it's written in there. They're saying that, yes, we have to protect these lands, but we also need to make sure that they're well-connected. So another multilateral agreement that is very important when thinking about ecological corridors, and this is something that my colleagues at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, they've been on working groups to help with this. So the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species and looking at wildlife connectivity. So this is a legally binding treaty of the UN. So countries that are signed up for this are committed to connectivity and thinking about, again, how protected areas as well as OECMs can integrate this. And then lastly, this, again, at the Center for Large Landscape level, we've realized that the importance of not only national legislation, but also regional, local legislation to create frameworks that support corridor development. Just by having that language in there to recognize protected areas aren't just enough, that we should be thinking about ecological corridors and putting that into our policy. So there's funding and time and resources that are allocated towards that. And I'll be talking about, at the national level, the US, we have the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. It's now allocated, I believe it was 400 million? Mel, I don't know if that's I don't remember the exact allocation amount, but there's a national policy now that supports wildlife corridor conservation, and they've allocated resources and funding to support that, somewhere, I believe, around along the lines of $400 million. So that gives a lot of resources on the national level to help with connectivity. So I'm sure if you've worked in conservation areas, you've probably referenced Bhutan before, and there's a reason for it. It's one of the countries in the world that have the most percentage of protected areas. It's quite impressive what they've done there. Not only does Bhutan have ecological corridors recognized by national policy, but they've built connectivity and corridors based around that. Other countries on the left here have also integrated that into their national policy. So Netherlands, Costa Rica, which I showed you before, Croatia, India, Kenya, and Malaysia are all examples that have integrated that and the idea of ecological corridors into their national policy. Again, the benefit of that is that when you have that integrated into national policy, funding, time, resources can be allocated towards that. So these are all the big guys, really smart people across the world that are working in this space. My colleagues at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation are in a lot of these working groups that are changing the way that people start to think about connectivity and ecological corridors. So these are international policy mandates that mention ecological corridors and that are advocating for it. So whether it's IUCN, the Convention of Migratory Species, CMS, United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, you name it. So you see, there's a lot of people across the world that are working on this, and you should be too, right? And the reason I show this is that it's not just happening on a local level, but internationally they're recognizing the importance of this. 20 by 30 isn't enough, right? We have to think about how we're connecting these lands. Connecting lands is important, but the Center for Large Landscape also talks about the importance and how to get local people involved in this right from the beginning. The good news is, again, you've already started with this process. So the Center for Large Landscape, CLC, developed these 10 steps to help people get familiar with how to do this. So they start with defining the setting. What is our connected network going to look like? What space are we talking about? Understanding the importance of the threats to connectivity, create a vision and scenarios of a connected landscape. It's funny because I'm reading these and I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. You've done this, right? It's really exciting because you've done this. Assess ecological, social, economic, political conditions and potential impacts. Again, you're doing a great job. Prioritizing corridors or connectivity areas. It sounds like we're making steps in that direction. You've already been thinking about that. Developing a management and monitoring plan. Like I said, it's not just managing it, it's monitoring it over the long term, making long-term plans for that, setting criteria and indicators for it. Developing the implementation plan. How is this going to actually roll out? And it's not a rollout, it's something that's developed over time. You implement it, monitor, and then you adaptively manage it. Shortly, I'll be sharing with you another example of smart corridors, how to adaptively manage based on climate change or environmental impacts. So here, this part 2, I'll be talking about this section. This section's much shorter, don't worry. This section is highlighting 2 examples that I've seen in the field. But first, I want to frame this. My area of expertise, again, I know about ecological corridors, I know about connectivity, but my area of expertise is UNESCO Biosphere Reserves. And what is interesting about biospheres, wait, I have another poll. Who knows what a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve is in here? Big raise of hand. All right, this is good. Okay, cool. So those that don't know, UNESCO Biosphere Reserves are kind of like the lesser known UNESCO designation. You might have heard of like World Heritage Site, the Colosseum or something like that. Biosphere reserves are non-traditional protected areas. I always like to say it's your kind of, not your average protected area. The reason is there's 3 zones in a biosphere that screams the need for connectivity, and I'll show you what those zones are. So this is what a traditional biosphere looks like. The truth is none of them look as pretty and perfect as this, but biospheres have 3 zones. They have the core area that's typically the traditional protected area. It's usually a national park. In the US, you'll see most of the national parks happen to be biospheres, but half of the people don't even know what a biosphere is. They just know the national park. There's that core area. The second piece is a buffer zone. So that buffer zone is kind of protecting that core area, making sure that it's not, huge impacts. And then the third is the transition area. And when you think about these zones, this was done on purpose. This design was done strategically to make sure that we don't disconnect people from nature, right? We want people living in nature, but living better with nature. And so that's why I think biospheres are so cool. Honestly, that's why I work with biospheres. I don't think there's a benefit of taking people away from nature completely. I think the reality is we're alive, and we have to learn how to live within nature. These zones try to do that, but I'll tell you, it's not perfect, and it's really messy. But what makes it better is connectivity and corridors. So when you have a great protected area, you have a national park. In our case, in the Champlain Adirondack in New York, we have a state park, right? That's our protected area. But then we have buffer zones. So in our buffer zone, if we can have a corridor that helps, with the connectivity through the buffer, and then even into the transition zones, right? So again, that's what's really interesting about biospheres, because by design, there is an embedded need for connectivity. And I'll tell you though, I recently joined the International Advisory Committee for Biospheres, and it's funny, when I look at zonation, I'm like, ooh, they don't have great connectivity here, right? So you can see when I look at their map, you could see right away, they have a great protected area. Most of them have really awesome protected areas, but maybe not so far away, there's a mine. That's a lot, right? So when you think about this design and like how this can lead to habitat fragmentation and biodiversity loss, and if you are in an area or an animal that's in an area that's protected, and then you have a mine right next door, right? So it's how do you figure that out? How do you allow for some connectivity there? So again, I think biospheres are ripe and great examples of the need for connectivity just by zonation alone. Okay. So I'm going to share with you, in the US, so at the moment right now, I'm the national coordinator for our 28 biospheres in the US. So I actually work closely with a colleague of yours who I really like, Kate Potter, a fellow Canadian. She is the executive director of the Canadian Biosphere Reserve Association. So Kate and I talk regularly about different projects that we're working on in both of our networks. And so what's interesting about each of these biospheres, as I mentioned, a lot of our biospheres in the US, you'll probably notice Yellowstone and Grand Teton, Mojave, Colorado, a lot of these are national parks, and very, very few of them actually leverage their biosphere designation. They focus on their core protected area, but don't have a lot going on in the buffer and transition zones in terms of managing it as a biosphere, but I won't get into that detail for today. We'll focus on just connectivity. So For the first case study I'm going to share, it's taking place in the biosphere that I work closely with, the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere. So I'll tell you a bit about that biosphere and the project that is related to connectivity there. So we received the designation in 1989. For the purpose of today, I'm going to just be talking about the New York side of the biosphere. So we have a transboundary biosphere, New York and Vermont. It's a giant, giant landscape. So in terms of the surface area, it's just under 4 million hectares. So the Adirondack State Park alone, which this is the area that I'm going to be focusing on for the case study, is 2.4 million hectares. So it's a very, very large protected area. And similar to you, we have a mix of public and private land. So it's about 45% public lands and 55% private lands. So as you can imagine, when we're thinking about conservation, we like to say the Adirondacks is the great experiment in conservation. And so there's actually a book written about that. So it's a really interesting mix, and it's been an interesting challenge from a management perspective. I just want to check, Jeff, how am I doing with time? Perfect. Okay, cool. So for the sake of time, I'm going to share with you first case study. I'll tell you a bit of backstory about this, and I'm going to speed up to make sure that I stay on schedule. So the first example of a strong ecological corridor is the Adirondacks to Algonquin Collaborative. So this involves our lovely country of the US and your lovely country of Canada. So the story behind this is quite fascinating. It actually stemmed from a moose, a very famous moose that was tagged right not far from where our college is in the Adirondacks, Paul Smith College. So it was tagged at the SUNY SF Ecological Center, I believe it was in 1998. They named this moose Alice, and they watched Alice over 2 years walk and swim across not only the St. Lawrence River, but also walked across a 4-lane highway in Ontario, all the way, as you see her path, it started in the Adirondack Park. She traveled just about, I think it was 570 kilometers, all the way to the Algonquin Park. And so as you can imagine, after swimming across the St. Lawrence and crossing a 4-lane highway, the scientists that were following Alice, exactly, exactly, they were like, holy crap, poor Alice, right? Like, oh. So yeah, exactly. Pretty impressive. But what is more impressive was the outcome of Alice's journey. It shed a light on, oh my gosh, we have an issue with connectivity here, and animals are moving like this all the time. And more importantly, how can we help animals like Alice, bear, moose, wolves, do the same trip? And so what's interesting is that cross borders, we've now set up this collaborative to make that happen. Next slide, please. Thanks, Jeff. So this is what it looks like. So you see the area outlined in terms of the actual area that's included in this route. And together, this collaborative works to facilitate connected landscapes. The idea is they're talking about how can we improve connectivity in there? How can we make sure our protected areas within these boundaries, these huge protected areas, meaning the Adirondack Park and then also Algonquin, how can we make sure that wildlife can travel safely, right? To make sure that the journey is not as treacherous as Alice's was. She passed away in 2001, so a year after her epic 2-year-long trek. They don't know. They said it was from natural causes, but they were able to trace her with the monitor. So, but anyway, we all learned from Alice, and I think that what's great is that this collaborative is growing really strong. So just for the sake of time, I'm going to go through. Jeff, if you don't mind animating that, yeah, you can go all the way to the bottom. Thank you.
Kelly, please don't rush. We are all loving this. So.
Oh, you want to hear more about Alice? Because I'll tell you all about Alice. I could talk about Alice for days. So thanks, Jarvis. Cool, cool. Yeah. So the one thing I do want to highlight is, and I'm actually almost done, so is that in addition to thinking about wildlife connectivity, the interesting thing that happened and that A2A has built, So there is an enormous network working on this now, and it's really interesting cross-sector partnerships that look at tourism impacts, that look at wildlife connectivity, that look at conservation, biodiversity loss, all under this one collaborative. One of the interesting things I thought was really cool and unexpected, I don't think when they designed this collaborative that they had this in mind, but recently they actually created a trail. And so when I was first thinking about corridors, I was like, I just thought of wildlife connectivity. I was like, think of Alice's route, that was it. But what was really interesting is that they realized that that same beautiful trail that Alice took, we could be walking and experiencing too. And they now have interpretive signage to tell about Alice's journey. So when you're thinking about creating corridors, it's not just for animals, it's for us too, right? So, and that could be an opportunity to educate people about the importance of connectivity and Alice's, or I don't know, an eagle's journey, whatever. You name the species in there and you can put it in there. So again, that's an interesting way to think about corridors in the context of creating tourism opportunities. They've also, their collaborative has also created conservation action planning, joint collaborative conservation action planning across borders. I've been really impressed by the outcomes. And it's funny, when I first heard about A2A, it was through a steering committee member of mine on the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere. She was a county forester. She's now retired. Her name is Nancy Patch. She worked in Vermont for Chittenden County. And it was interesting, when she was telling me about this initiative, I was curious. I was like, but you know, it just seems so, I was like, how is it funded? Like what, you know, who shows up at this? And it's interesting, Nancy's still involved, although she's retired. And the group of A to A has grown at an exponential level. So it's really encouraging to see. And speaking of youth, there's a lot of youth that are now involved in this collaborative. They see the benefits of this, and now we're starting to integrate a much wider audience into this initiative. They've conducted road ecology research, and they host a series of science symposiums. So their outputs are far more than just wildlife connectivity, and that's what I find interesting about it. All right. Next slide, please. So the next one, I want to go for it.
Is the Frontenac Arc not also united?
Yeah. So what is your name, sir? Robert Packard. Great work there. So Robert just asked a question. Is the Frontenac Arch Biosphere area also Biosphere Reserve? It is. And so it's within that, it's within the A2A corridor. So when you're looking at the Algonquin to Adirondacks, it's absolutely in there. The other thing, fun fact, our biosphere has a twinning agreement. The Champlain Adirondack has a twinning agreement with the Frontenac Arch Biosphere. And I'm going to be quite honest with you. When we were building our steering committee, we followed everything that they did. We copied exactly what they did. They were our mentors throughout. So, and they've continued to be. So it's not only part of A2A, but we work together as two biospheres cross borders. So thanks for bringing that up, Robert. I know, I am, thanks. Good stuff. So the next example I wanted to share with you is a European Union project. It's a LIFE project that was focused on protecting alpine wolves. So this encompasses 4 countries. So it's France, Italy, Slovenia, and Austria. I've worked with this project in Italy, and it's been really interesting to see how this has changed over time. The first time that I went and I learned about this project was back, I think it started, I'm trying to remember, 2016, I think I first learned about it. But it's really interesting about how, and I hesitate to say this because there's still really bad wildlife human conflict there. I say that it's a working model, but they still are really struggling with human-wildlife conflict. But in any event, this is a very large-scale connectivity example. It's very well funded. So again, when we're thinking about money, this one was funded EU. I think the total budget was 11 million for this. EU kicked in 7 million of the 11 million euros. So it wasn't a small project. So what this project did, you can transition, Jeff, thank you. So what this project did was, the alpine wolf species was starting to go, it was threatened of extinction at the beginning of the 20th century for various reasons, due to honestly, killings of it. It was a lot of human conflict that was resulting in that, and also related to several other issues. I don't want to get into that because I'll spend 20 minutes talking about that. But in any event, in the Western Alps, the natural recovery of the species started to happen in the 90s. And over time, they realized that, and they formed, an EU funded this project in order to protect this. And they realized that a key part of the protection was developing a corridor between these 4 countries. And what could that look like? So not only allowing the wolves to roam, but more importantly, the areas that the wolves were going to, educating the locals about the importance of that wolf population, because the farmers were just like, this is it. We're not having this. I understand. I was a farmer, like who wants a wolf around? And that unfortunately still happens. There's still a lot of wolf killings that happen in the area. But what was interesting, a lot of the funding was going into educating about the importance of corridors, importance of that species, but more importantly, thinking collaboratively about how to protect that species. So instead of seeing it as a villain, right, that darn wolf, that we know the whole story about how wolves can be bad for agriculture. So in any event, it has helped. It's changed the perception of wolves. The last time I was in Italy was 2022, and there's still wolf killings that are happening there. So again, it's not fixed, but at least the idea and the importance of connectivity for this population was communicated, and they're starting to improve the human-wildlife conflicts through these corridors. All right, so I'm gonna wrap up. I'm at the last part of my presentation here. So a few key takeaways that I just want to highlight about those case studies. So first and foremost, bioregional collaboration with connectivity and systematic conservation planning are key. That's how it happens. Collaborative governance and cross-sector partnerships, I said that in the very beginning, that's key. Mixed source funding. And then I'll go back to that quote that I mentioned. You can't manage what you can't monitor. So the importance of monitoring over time, setting those indicators over time is critical. Communication, outreach, and education are critical. Again, you're doing that already. And then lastly, the need to recognize ecological corridors in regional, national, and subnational law and policy. Again, both of those examples, especially the one in the EU, ecological corridors are now built into those 4 countries. So it's really interesting of how they're talking about and thinking about ecological corridors. Next slide, please. Okay. Next slide, please. So I just want to highlight some things here in terms of monitoring and innovation. This, based on the show of hands that we had in the room, I think these concepts are probably not new to a lot of you. So in terms of how to monitor ecological corridors and make sure they're successful, connectivity modeling is a key piece. IUCN and CLLC developed a really cool tool. It's about a 45-page toolkit of how to do this, about what connectivity modeling looks like. So structural, functional modeling, so all of the heavy kind of scientific details in there. And I'm happy to share that link with you, but it's a playbook of how to do it. The use of satellite data, GIS mapping, remote sensing. I know there's a lot of people in this room that are familiar with that, so they're critical to monitoring species movement and habitat health. Smart corridors are super important. This is something I actually think the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative does really well. They have adaptive management to changing environments, so they understand that impacts of climate change. They use predictive modeling to see what they anticipate to happen and then adjust their conservation efforts based on that. Another thing I've seen, especially in Italy, is involving citizen science in these efforts. So using apps like iNaturalist to get students and youth in the community to catalog biodiversity and climate change within the community. So here are some of the resources that I mentioned. I'm happy to share more. Again, CLLC, if you go on Center for Large Landscape Conservation, they have a ton of resources on their website. So as I mentioned before, the IUCN guidelines for connectivity, to me, that's all you need. It's a really great resource of everything that you need to know about the definitions of how to actually make this happen. They have great case studies that are integrated in there. The second one that I mentioned before, the technical guidelines on systematic conservation with connectivity. So again, very similarly, they look at, this is more of a technical one. So if you're interested in modeling around connectivity. That's the second one's the one for you, the technical aspect, the technical one. The third one is UNEP created a conservation monitoring protected planet database. Bruce, I think I shared this with you. It's a really cool online database. So say, for instance, if I wanted to go on there and say, oh, you know, what % of protected lands exist in Bhutan, or what % of protected lands exist in Costa Rica, this website has all of that. So you can do a comparative analysis between countries and see where you're standing in Canada in comparison to the rest of the world. And they update that often. Lastly, there's a land trust and wildlife crossing toolkit that's available to understand how to create connectivity with land trust and wildlife crossings. Next slide, please. So this isn't out yet. I wanted to show you a hint that this is coming, and an exciting toolkit that IUCN is working on. So it's a world database on ecological corridors. So they're developing, because there's the Protected Planet database shows you the protected areas, but there's not a database to show you all of the corridors, the ecological corridors. So this database is in development. I argue that they should be together, but you know how things go. So eventually, I think they're going to merge both resources together. So this, I don't know when this is going to come out. It's been in development for a really long time, so I hope sooner than later. Next slide, please. So your role and why we're here today. Again, you're doing incredible work already. I've been impressed by the progress that I've seen so far, and I think that your trajectory is, you know, you're on the right path here. In terms, regardless of who you are, whether you're a policymaker, whether you're a scientist, conservation community member, maybe you're retired and just interested in protecting this incredible landscape, advocate for corridor-friendly policies, support conservation efforts, and collaborate with others to make this a reality. So together, we can create a connected, resilient, and biodiverse future. But I'm not done. I have one more thing. I have one more nugget. Next slide, please. I want to share this quote with you because, as you could see, I really like UNESCO Biosphere Reserves. So this quote came from, we had developed a toolkit, a communication toolkit, how to talk about biosphere reserves. And I think this quote is particularly relevant to today. So the quote says, "Life is an amazing series of connections between people and nature, between knowledge and action, across time and place. If these connections break, we put our collective quality of life at risk. If we keep them strong, we build a future that inspires us all." Thank you.
We've got time for a couple of questions. You okay with that?
Yeah.
I'm just going to switch mics. Fantastic. She turned me off. I think we have a couple of minutes for some questions. If there are a few, I think we have 5 minutes. We're going to switch you to that mic.
Thanks.
Who has questions? Here we go. I'm whipping around. Nice and loud.
Hi, I'm just interested. It's not you said you had more information about Alice. I find that fascinating and very relevant to the problem here because I've seen the deer population even decimated. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks. I just want to hear more about Alice if she has more to tell us.
It's on. It's on. Just talk. Talk.
There should be a Netflix series about Alice. Can you hear? Okay. So in terms of Alice, geez, there should be a Netflix series. So what do you want to know? I could tell you where she started. I could tell you the path that she went on. On A2A's website, it kind of outlines her whole journey and the difficulty from it. So I think the key thing is that the thing that stood out so much is that she was swimming across the St. Lawrence and that she was crossing a 4-lane highway. And so that was a pivotal moment in her story. It wasn't just the distance that she was traveling, it was the adversity that she was going through to get there. And that emphasized the need for connectivity. And so I could tell you more about her, but is there anything else that you want to know? Yeah.
Is this what a lot of moose do? Like, are moose driven to work between these two locations?
Yeah. So she's not unique, no, and that's what the tipping point was. She just so happened to be collared and tagged at that time, and they were following, and they didn't realize. So I think at the time, they didn't realize they traveled so far. So she was the one that kind of tipped the scales to say, oh, this is a really big problem. So moose can travel like that. She happened to be one that traveled that far at that time to see it. So now, since that happened, more moose can travel like that. But the problem was, I don't think anyone realized the scope of the danger that she was in until that happened. Go for it. Yeah?
Just a question around what's the criteria for a protected area? When does it become a corridor? What's the size? Do you have criteria for that?
So size of protected area or corridor?
A corridor, like when does a protected area actually become a corridor?
So different, right? So IUCN's definition of the protected area would be kind of like the traditional national park or a nature reserve. So the corridor would be the piece that connects the protected area to, say, somebody's private land. Maybe you have a home that you've created an easement on. So the corridor is the one that connects the two. So in terms of size, there's no size definition, but it's more of the understanding like the piece. You know, this is kind of, think of it as the glue. I also heard it described as like a three-legged stool, right? So like you can have protected areas, other areas of conservation, the OECMs, and then the third leg of the stool is that corridor. Does that make sense? So not any size to say this is what's good. It could be small, but we like to think in large scale because our belief is that large scale conservation is the way that we're helping with biodiversity loss and habitat loss. So thanks. Yeah.
Is it on? Hello? Okay, thank you. My name is Torsten. Thank you for this great presentation. In a week, we have the Convention on Biodiversity, COP16, and one of the great opportunities is that what's her name, Susanna Muhammad, she's a great advocate for sharing land with agriculture through agroecology.
Yes.
And that means by farming with nature, we don't spare for land. Meanwhile, I learned in Canada and North America, if it's not this, it must be that. That's a CBC show that ran for many years. If it's not conservation, it must be monoculture, whether it's our lawn or whether it's a biological, agricultural monoculture. We don't share land, we divide. Other examples how agroecological or land sharing has been used to create those corridors, because if we could convert our lawns into biodiverse areas and our agricultural fields into biodiverse areas, we'd be happy.
Yeah.
Are there examples? Thank you.
Yeah. So excellent. What was your name?
Thorsten.
Thorsten, thank you. So really good question. So agroecology, agroforestry, it's an example of an OECM. So that's an OECM, and it's an excellent example. So to answer your question, Nepal has agroforestry. Mel was just there. Mel took students from Paul Smith College to visit Nepal. And I don't know if you visited some of the OECMs there, but they have agroforestry that are connected to protected landscapes. So that's an interesting example to look at. So any area that you think of that has agroecology, because I agree with you, right? So that is that qualifies as OECM. So now thinking about that area, so if you have that farm that's using agroforestry, how do you connect that to another protected area? So that's the question. How does that corridor happen? Is it another easement that's close by? So, but there's several examples. There's also examples in the Tuscan Emilian Apennine biosphere in Italy. They use agroecology as well. And so they connect to their national parks. So they have corridors that are built to help with the wolf population. There's also a bear population there. So those are examples. So they have OECMs, that agroecology and agroforestry that connect to their protected areas. Good question. Yeah. Sorry.
And one over here.
Oh, I'll let you do the question.
No, we can take one more, and I'm going to give you the awkward opportunity to choose. I did see two over here.
Okay.
We definitely have more questions than we have time, but here's the good news. Kelly's staying for lunch. You can grab your lunch tray and cozy on up with her. Have a grilled cheese, and we can get into that. Yeah.
Oh, geez, I don't know. Maybe 2 quick ones. We'll just go here and then we'll go over here. So, okay. Yeah.
I don't understand.
When we're doing these corridors, just as a basic principle, when we're talking about creating corridors for wildlife to migrate, are we creating the corridors along existing migration patterns, or are we trying to mitigate disrupted migration routes
Good question.
or restore disrupted migration routes? Because a lot of damage has already been done
Yeah.
by mining.
Really good
and,
question.
you know.
It depends on the area, right? So my answer is it depends on the area. So in some cases, you lean into the existing migration patterns. And to your question, there are other areas that it might have shifted because of climate impacts. And so it really depends on the region. I'm trying to think off the top of my head of one that, I can't think of one that, most of the ones that I've worked with are the natural kind of what we've seen. However, like I was talking about the smart corridors, there's adaptation based on that. So the Y2K, like the Yellowstone to Yukon, that adapts. And so that kind of, it's a hybrid of both. It started with one, but then it recognized, and that's the idea of a smart corridor, it changes based on environmental changes, and it uses predictive modeling to change that. So it depends on the area. Yeah, thanks. I like your glasses. All right, a quick one. I'm sorry, Jarvis.
That's
I
okay.
know.
One more,
Go,
Kelly.
one more.
You said that advocacy was one of our roles.
Yeah.
Would voting be another role for everybody in this room?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yes, voting is
Can
important.
I ask another smart-ass question? Would putting the 401 in a tunnel help Alice get across?
Alice would have had a much easier time, right? Good one. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Good one, Sandy. I think we just